Welcome to the Superhumanize podcast. My name is Ariana Summer and I'm your host. My guest today is someone whose work has shaped the very code of modern biology and whose vision continues to ripple across fields as vast as genomics, synthetic biology, age reversal, and artificial intelligence. Dr. George Church is a true pioneer, professor of genetics at Harvard Medical School, a molecular engineer, chemist, and serial entrepreneur as the co-founder of more than 50 biotech companies. He has helped invent many of the technologies that now define the genomic era, from CRISPR optimization to DNA data storage. And he was one of the very first humans to ever publicly share his full genome and medical history. In this conversation, we explore the edge where science meets spirit. We talk about synthetic biology as a modern myth, DNA as a vessel of intelligence, and what it means to engineer life with intention. We dive into radical transparency, longevity research, AI collaboration, and the philosophical gravity of rewriting the arc of aging. This episode is not just about technology, it is about becoming. It is about asking, what does it mean to choose our evolution consciously, ethically, and with awe?
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.
Dr. Church, what a pleasure. Thank you for joining us on the Superhumanized podcast today.
I'm pleased to be here with you.
And I cannot even begin to say how pleased I am we get to spend time with you because your body of work is vast. But before we dive into that, I would actually like to begin with something that struck me on a very human level. You once described spending 100 hours a week in the lab as a student, so fully immersed that everything fell away. And this kind of total absorption feels familiar to me in a way as someone who has often poured herself into creative or intellectual pursuits with a big intensity, almost like for myself, like being in a trance. And it made me wonder, what was pulling you in that deeply, Dr. Church? Was it curiosity? Was it devotion or perseverance, or maybe something older, ancestral, perhaps?
Probably a little bit of all of those things. I would say it was mainly curiosity combined with kind of an engineering drive to try to make the world a better place. And it wasn't arrogant enough to think that I could do that, but I felt that I at least should try. Yeah, so it was a little of each.
And do you think that kind of a deep, almost obsessive immersion is necessary for real breakthroughs in innovation? Or do you think it's more of a personal trait with regard to yourself, a temperament perhaps?
No, I don't think it was necessarily very productive. In fact, in the process, I filtered out the rest of the world so well that I flunked out of graduate school. So that's not productive particularly, although it did end up with me going to a better graduate school. I think there's times to focus and there are other times where you need to think freely. And I think a lot of my best ideas come from when I'm actually either falling asleep or waking up, which I do all the time since I'm narcoleptic. But I think I was working hard and still am working hard because I need to fill my head up with lots of organized and random facts so they can jostle around in there and be creative with something. I think if you really completely isolated yourself so you have no input, almost sensory deprivation, I think there's less for your creativity to work with. You're forced to be creative with what little you have, but I think you need a little of both. You need time where there's time to be creative and time to fill your head up with things multiple disciplines to allow them to collide.
Certainly. And what you mentioned about your narcolepsy and some of your best ideas coming to you when you actually nap, I found that really fascinating. A lot of great thinkers, creators, Salvador Dali comes to mind. He actually liked to put himself into this, not the deep sleep, but this intermediate state by
Right.
putting
He would hold something in his hand. Yeah. Yeah.
exactly. And so I find it really fascinating how these types of states that we can't consciously curate, how they can actually bring forth some of the most important sparks or ideas. And I also found it remarkable that you are somebody who really subscribes to this, which to me shows a certain type of maybe also humility in the approach of creation, as if nothing has to be completely controlled all of the time.
Very much. I'm not much of a control freak for myself or for people around me.
Yeah.
I think there's a lot to be said for serendipity and engineered serendipity. It's not entirely luck. It's more like making your luck. I think it was Jefferson once said that he was very lucky in his life, and he found out the harder you work, the luckier he was. So I thought that's the kind of luck that one wants to engineer.
Yes. And speaking about hard work, one of your fields of work, Dr. Church, synthetic biology, has become one of the most influential and also controversial frontiers in modern science. It's really been reshaping everything from medicine to agriculture, from sustainability to space. And at its core, to me, it's not just about building or modifying life, it's about creating a life. And when I reflect on that, I can't help but feel that we are entering the realm of myth, of Prometheus, of Genesis stories, of humanity holding fire in its hands. And you are often described as a pioneer in the field. So I wonder, do you think of science, especially synthetic biology, as maybe even something aside from this scientific aspect, something that is perhaps sacred or mythic? And if so, how do you see your own role in it as an engineer, an artist, a steward, or maybe something else entirely?
There is some art involved. I have a full-time artist who's a hybrid, knows science very well as well, and is very interdisciplinary. And I think that a lot of people in the laboratory that I work with think about things. There's a certain aesthetics to the experiments, to the way you publish them, and so forth. So there's a component of art that we're seeking. There was one article we wrote on recording information into bacterial DNA, and and we chose to encode a series of photographs of a movie that Muybridge had done of a galloping horse. And one of the reviewers said that we should have made it of a random dot matrix. And I felt, do you really think that's going to be easier to communicate to the public? And in terms of testing the concepts, might be a tiny bit more statistically significant, but basically galloping horse is a pretty random thing to be encoding. So anyway, there's an element of art involved, definitely, that we respect.
Yes, I love that, Dr. Church. And that actually also struck me as one of the, from my own perspective, one of the most poetic frontiers of your work. DNA as a medium of memory, and the idea that we could store centuries or even millennia of data in just a few grams of encoded DNA preserved in bacteria, self-replicating, self-repairing. That's not just technically astounding. It's, to me, as also a storyteller and a writer, that's mythic. It reminds me of something, maybe you're familiar with the name, the anthropologist Jeremy Narby explores in his book, The Cosmic Serpent. He speaks about how ancient Amazonian shamans describe DNA as not only the code of life, but a living intelligence, something that transmits as much as it stores. And I know you've described DNA as a kind of a modern information system, but I wonder if you see it or maybe even sense it as something more than that?
Yeah, I think you were speaking of mythic. I think in a certain sense, DNA is mythic, not just becoming mythic recently, but it's something that connects us all the way back to the dawn of time and dawn of life billions of years ago. It connects all living things. It encodes in a very compact way amazing creatures, people that are larger than life in the sense that we start with 6 billion base pairs inherited from our mother and our father in just a little single cell, sperm and egg. 6 billion base pairs, or you can think of it as 12 billion bits of information, are hardly enough to define our sentient being, our memories, and all that stuff. What it is, it creates the prepared vessel into which everything can be organized, and each person then becomes so much bigger than their 6 billion base pairs that they inherited. In fact, it would probably take at least petabytes of information to do a decent job of copying us once we're adults, but all it takes is a few gigabytes to get us going. That's what I mean by larger than life, or larger than when we started, in a very, I think, profound way. And we need to respect that heritage, just like we respect our ancestors and our environment and so forth.
Yes, indeed, Dr. Church. And that being said, that this small amount compared to the large amount that we developed into later, that gets us started, to put it into very laymanish terms. Do you see DNA perhaps as a vessel of intelligence beyond biology? And yeah, let me start with that.
Yeah. So it probably in the future, arguably haven't ruled out being such a thing in the past. We don't really know what's encoded in our genomes. There's lots of unexplained DNA throughout the biosphere. There's parts of the biosphere we haven't even seen yet as well. But I would say certainly going forward, there is the potential of DNA, which was pointed out in that paper, or actually a different paper that we wrote on DNA as a storage device, which is that it lasts longer. It could last. The record now is getting close to 2 million years old DNA, and it probably is longer than that. But pieces of it are readable even further back. So you can reconstruct things that are 3 billion years old by the phylogenetic tree, the tree of life. So that's still all biological, but going forward, we were exploring the possibility that you could encode books, including their photographs, movies, audio. Essentially everything could be stored in DNA for long-term storage, but also you could have it for infrequent use. You have to respect the current status of reading and writing DNA isn't the way it's going to be, since it's on an exponentially improving curve. It's going to be quite different in the near future. But even today, there are ways that you could write the DNA basically for free if you have biological systems that are like bringing in data through their eyes and ears, and that's being encoded physiologically, and the physiology goes into DNA, then that becomes kind of a camcorder, a DNA camcorder. And a lot of things that are recorded in video, like security cameras, no one really ever looks at most of it. It's only if something bad happens that you go back and you look at it. So you could have a fairly inefficient modern decoding reading device. And maybe in the future we'll have very efficient ones, but even today, if we had this kind of ability to record things and only look for really amazing events, that might be useful. Anyway, and a whole consortium has arisen from those early papers that I mentioned worldwide to explore this. It doesn't mean that they're right or that I'm right. It just means that it's interesting to explore.
It is absolutely interesting to explore, Dr. Church, and it just makes me think about also what it means for humanity to actually begin consciously encoding our stories into the very fabrics of life. And knowing that this can be preserved for such a long time, does this shift how you view time? If encoded DNA can survive thousands or even millions of years, do you ever think about who or what might someday decode it?
Yeah, so we still are in a uncertain, there's a great deal of uncertainty as to whether there's any other intelligent beings in the entire universe, or at the other extreme, there may be so many intelligent beings in the universe that our world is packed with them that we're not observing. They're either more stealthy or more intelligent or both. And I'm not sure where where any of us stand along this spectrum, but certainly if they're cohabiting with us now in a stealthy manner, they're probably reading all this stuff already anyway. If they're very far away, if they're millions of light years away, they may never see it. Even with a longevity of 2 million years, it may be decayed by the time they get to it. So it's all tangled up with, are we alone?
And the open stance that you are offering us here, Dr. Church, really resonates with me. That's, of course, a little segue, and I know we could talk about this ad nauseum and not come to any conclusion. People who have devoted their lives to studying it can't even come to a solid conclusion, delivering the kinds of facts we nowadays want to have handed to us. But what do your senses tell you? Just from one human being to the other, I'm curious. What does your innermost tell you about this question? Are we alone? Obviously, this is not a scientific question. It's just a human curiosity question.
Yeah, I have a tendency to speculate about the future and technology and not so much about the present. So the present is, are we alone? I don't know. But will we be alone? Probably not, because hopefully we can survive long enough to get a few of us off the planet, and then we'll become children of the stars, and we just go all over the place. And some of us will maybe return back, but most of us will be going out initially slowly, maybe at some point sending out seedlings close to light speed. And then we probably won't feel alone. There may be other unintended negative consequences, but hopefully by the time we're doing that, we've maybe come to terms with our aggressive nature and become more like bonobos than we are right now.
Indeed. And what I find so fascinating about bonobos, from the little bit that I know about them, is that they're great at resource sharing.
Yes.
And not only the food, but companionship, sex not just as a means for procreation, but for social cohesion, keeping the peace and establishing stronger social bonds. So yes, I like what you're saying about bonobos. There's a lot to be learned from them.
Right.
And what you mentioned about hopefully humanity surviving, I am an eternal optimist. I also mix in with that hope, the hope and the desire for us, not only surviving, but thriving. That being said, and looking at what you have shared about DNA previously, that DNA storage is ideal for archiving what humanity wants to preserve long term. So what do you personally think is worth preserving in that way? If you could choose a few things to store inside DNA for the next million years, Dr. Church, what would they be?
I think at some level we have to have some humility that what we have today might be even more amazing a decade from now and centuries. Certainly from a technological standpoint, I mean to say that technology is the main thing to store, but just as a way of assessing the humility or the humbleness of our current status, is that very often a new technology will come along and we can repeat almost everything in that field in a few years. We can redo a century worth of work in a few years. Now, for example, DNA sequencing. We spent $3 billion sequencing the first human genome at fairly low quality. And then just a few years later, we were doing 5 genomes for $1,000 each. And then a few years after that, now we're doing them at maybe less than $200, and we're doing millions of them. And so now that doesn't represent our full culture and the wisdom of the ages, but to some extent, all of our culture and wisdom of the ages, to the extent that they are capturable at all, say digitally or by word of mouth, which can be recorded now, we don't have to be that selective. We could encode all of that. It's on the order of exabytes, 10 to the 18th, and we could record all of that and make lots of making copies is inexpensive for DNA. We made 70 billion copies of my book, for example, and then we can spread those out into cold, radiation-resist hardened parts of our solar system. So I don't think we have to be that selective, but we should be humble in the likely that we will be greatly augmenting that, especially if all 8 billion of us, if we overcome diseases of poverty, we might all and roboticize our world. We might have lots of time to create new works of knowledge, wisdom, art, so forth.
That's something that really fascinates me about where we're going, particularly with robotics and AI, the combination of that as well, to free up more of the resources that human beings have via our brains, our soul, our spirit, our mind, to not just focus on things that need to get done in order to survive. Circling back to DNA, all the potential with DNA, what we just talked about, as well as all the work that you have done with it, do you ever feel that DNA is not just a technical substrate, so to speak, but maybe something like a sacred text in its own right, maybe something that even carries traces of consciousness, or maybe it is a form of consciousness?
Right. I think it's sacred in the sense that most of our sacred texts for major faiths are their respect is somewhat related to how old they are and how common they are. And DNA is something that is literally embraced by all human beings. It could be you don't have that many human beings that embrace and have carefully read the Quran and the Bible and various Hindu texts, but we all have embraced the DNA at some level. We've read it with our cells, maybe not with our eyes and brain. So it is sacred in that it really does define our ancestry. It defines some of who we are, not all of who we are. That's for experiences, but it sets us up for that. It deserves respect. So that's another thing that reflects its sacred nature. Certainly, it extends far into the future. I think it's safe to say, even if all the humans disappeared from the planet, the DNA would still keep probably evolving another intelligent. We have plenty of intelligent species already, but they would, who knows, they might reach for the stars as we are doing. Octopus, maybe even whales, even though they don't have opposable thumbs, they have their own priorities, and one of them might be getting off the planet at some point.
Off the planet they share with us.
Right.
Escape the humans. Those are really interesting thoughts, Dr. Church. And something you brought up just a few minutes ago that also really was of interest to me when I prepared for this conversation with you. Years before this ever went mainstream, you actually made your own genome and medical history public. And that kind of transparency is still rare. And to me, it feels almost like a form of radical intimacy of saying, here I am, fully known, not only as a scientist, but as a body, a story, a human pattern. And I'm curious, did it change anything in yourself to offer yourself up in that way, not just scientifically, but personally? And have you maybe seen a shift in others, whether colleagues, patients, or the public?
It was a team effort. The IRB, this is the committee at every organization that does research on human beings, looks at each proposal for its ethics. And our IRB said that I should do this alone, at least initially. And I said, really, I think I'd prefer to start out with 10 people. And it's now thousands. The goal was not to grow radically. It was really to do a demonstration, to see there were a lot of things we were doing that people said couldn't be done, not just the technical, couldn't sequence 6 billion base pairs perfectly, but which has now been done just this year, but just the sharing of data. And in fact, part of it was a response to, I felt, slightly dehumanizing protocols that were supposedly to protect the human research subjects. I felt that they were really protecting the researchers and the institutions. For example, there would be rules like, if we learn that you have something that's easily fixable but lethal, we can't tell you. If you want to see your data, we can't give it to you. If you want to share your data, also out of the question. This is the pre-existing set of rules, and so I specifically made an experimental consenting mechanism that allowed people to become educated. In fact, about the risks and benefits, and to demonstrate that by taking a little multiple choice exam, which they had to get 100% on. So it wasn't like we didn't want 80%, we wanted really 100%. And it turned out lots of people could do that. It wasn't, I don't think it was selecting for super smart people. It was just regular folks. And we could really then start sharing. We could share the medical records and DNA as you would with a physician, rather than mixing them all up in like balls in a bingo ball roller. We could share them as units, as integrated units, a holistic way that the physician should see. And we wanted to create lots of those holistic files that so physicians could, and researchers and software developers could see it the way that the physician of the future could see it. And then finally we would have meetings. We would have annual meetings on DNA Day, April 25th, I think, every year. And it was amazing. It's normally the research subjects are something that's de-identified and off stage, and all the scientists are making decisions by themselves, which I think is not ideal. And in this case, all the research subjects were in the room, and they had name badges. Hey, I'm PGP number 10. My name is James Shirley, and I'm PGP number 2, and my name is John Halamka. It was just much more shared experience, and we would have tests. We would invite people that could provide tests that would test the things that make us individually different, ranging from measuring anatomical components to full body scans to anything where you could get rich data sets, fMRI of the brain. And we would share this, and we would share our experiences and what we want. Since the people were there mixed in with the engineers and scientists, they could say, this is what we really want. We don't necessarily want this thing that you just showed us or we just experienced. Let's do something else. And it was just really an amazing thing that hasn't really been replicated. It was meant to be an experiment that would show people was feasible, and then other people would do it. That hasn't happened yet, but it probably will happen now that the cost of sequencing is almost free.
Yes, and this is such a beautiful example, or even principle stand, one could say, that you took in describing this, where science and the deep humanity gets interlinked, as from my perspective, would be very important also to do. Do you think that kind of openness, especially in a field like genetics, could eventually reshape our culture's relationship to how to conduct science, our relationship to privacy, health, and maybe even identity?
Yeah, it could. And with every technology that my lab develops, including things, software and kind of the social networking that we were just talking about, I try to couple it with cautionary tales to try to get us all to collectively think out of the box as to what could go wrong, and then how to mitigate that, and then what could go wrong with the mitigation and all that. And one of the things that comes up with personal genomics that we're talking about here is privacy concerns. And we very specifically, in the consent and the testing to make sure they had 100% comprehension of what they were consenting to. Most consenting forms, this is another thing that appalled me about the state of affairs before the Personal Genome Project, is you would just sign this big sheet of papers that was mostly written in some combination of legalese and that only lawyers could understand, and medicalese that only scientists could understand. And then they sign it. And often they'll sign it in the waiting room while they're waiting to see a physician. And they feel like, well, if I don't sign it, maybe I'm not going to get served. And so I think that was coercive. Ours was specifically wanted to see understanding before we let them into the room. But it turned out that privacy is, I think, there's a bunch of red herrings where we're worrying about X, but we really should be worrying about Y. It's not that we shouldn't be worrying at all. It's just don't get distracted. I think that rather than worrying about only germline engineering, we should also be worried about engineering of adults, not just fetuses. And in this case, we shouldn't be worrying only about the DNA that gets sequenced in some big open project. It's also the fact that we're dropping our DNA every day all over the place. And if some private investigator wants to know what our DNA is, it's super easy and legal as far as last time I checked. So that's what we should really be worrying about. That's the elephant in the room where everybody's distracted by this other thing. And it turned out that the government and the people supported the project to such an extent that when the time came around to develop DNA standards, they looked at all the different protocols in the world, all the consenting mechanisms and so forth, and they chose ours as the only one that was supported by the Food and Drug Administration, the FDA, the National Institute of Standards and Technology as standards. And it could be shared even with companies because we had thought in advance to consent individuals for the possibility that their information got re-identified, while most of the others promised de-identified. And if you're going to be sharing it with NIST and the FDA and the public and companies, it would be disingenuous to promise de-identification with no chance of re-identification, very high chance. Anyway, because we had put all that in that, they were in the NIST and the FDA, and then they became the first ones that were completely sequenced. The ones that were partially sequenced, the big announcement in the year 2001 and 2002 and so forth, those were not complete sequences. Now in 2025, we have complete sequences, and I'm glad to say that they are part of the Personal Genome Project.
Yes, we're living really in a time, to me, when we first were able to even partially sequence. And then, of course, years later, all these genetic tests, you get a box sent home. And of course, there's, it's not the Holy Grail, but very interesting, the beginning of that. To me, that felt so significant, even more significant than the invention of the printing press. A tsunami of changes, and not just scientifically, but medically. And as far as our humanity goes, as far as our culture goes, we are now entering a chapter of biology where the aim is no longer to just diagnose disease, to treat disease, but to actually transcend decline. And you have co-founded over 50 companies, and I'm just picking a couple here between Rejuvenate Bio and GC Therapeutics. Your work, Dr. Church, is helping shift the paradigm from repair to reprogramming, from slowing aging to actually redesigning how we age. And just the idea of using transcription factors to create programmable, off-the-shelf supercells, cells that could even surpass natural function, that feels to me like something out of speculative fiction, and yet it's happening. And I imagine this changes not just what we do medically, but how we understand our bodies, time, and even mortality. And for you being at the forefront of all of this, Dr. Church, what excites you most about this new frontier of cell and gene therapy, and not just in terms of scientific possibility, but in terms of what it could unlock for human life?
Yes, it's a very exciting time. And we have a lot of exponentials going off. Like we've already mentioned, the price of DNA sequencing coming down from $3 billion to $300 per human. That with cell and gene therapy and even organ therapy, they went from pipe dreams to reality. They're actually all three categories are now in clinical trials. So that means they've been proven to be safe and effective in animals. And now they're going into humans. We have the longest kidney transplant that we made from an engineered pig. You can think of this as a cell or organ therapy, is now somewhere between 4 and 5 months without rejection. Very healthy individual. He's known by name as Tim Andrews, and it's not a pseudonym. That's his real name, and he's just very happy. And now it's expanding. There's several efforts that are using our technology or closely related ones. So, for example, ours is being used at the Massachusetts General Hospital, and now in Japan has gotten 40 of our pigs. And then the two that you mentioned, Rejuvenate Bio and GC Therapeutics, these are making gene therapies and cell therapies that in principle, could rejuvenate our body by either taking DNA and putting it into our liver, and then the liver produces rejuvenating factors that go to every part of our body, or producing cells that can go into really inconvenient parts of our body, parts that might be affected by demyelinating diseases like multiple sclerosis. GC Therapeutics is making oligodendrocytes, sorry for the long word, that coat the white matter in your brain so that the signals can go fast, which is required for proper function. All of these things, the genes, the cells, and organ therapies, are in a certain sense smarter. It's like this cell phone is way smarter than the supercomputer I used as a teenager. And part of that is you can measure the number of bits. And the small molecules that we've been using, which has been the basis of amazing pharmacology since hundreds of years ago, we've been using these small molecules in various ways, some of them completely synthetic, some of them derived from natural products and ancient lore. But they have the problem that they basically dose the entire body. That you inject them or you swallow them, and it goes throughout the body. And they target crudely. That is to say, if something looks like a particular molecule, it's either agonist or antagonist for a particular binding site. It'll bind to everything that looks like that. So if it's like ATP, which is a very common molecule, it'll bind to all the ATP binding sites throughout your body and throughout your proteins. And you can tune it up as best you can, but you're starting with a problem. But here, you can deliver these gene, cell, and organ therapies to exactly where they belong, and they'll stay there. They won't diffuse throughout the whole body. They're very specific because you're not going to hit every gene. You're going to hit the one gene that you're using. So anyway, you can tell I'm very highly biased towards these particular categories of new technologies, but it's really a great pleasure and honor to be in the presence of lots of other scientists that are exploring these different avenues.
I'm also in my way biased towards this, Dr. Church, and I love witnessing your passion and your excitement. And I'm looking out on Montana Avenue right now. I'm sitting at one of our businesses, a longevity clinic. And here in Los Angeles alone, what you said about the rejuvenation factors, I think you termed them, that could be produced by your liver, that alone would make anyone a fortune. But on a more human level, a very dear friend of ours, he has been battling multiple sclerosis for, probably 20 years. You may have come across his name, Montel Williams, former syndicated talk show host, naval intelligence, which a lot of people don't know. And I know he'll be very excited hearing about what you just shared. And I'm curious, Dr. Church, do you envision a future where these types of personalized precision cell therapies become as routine as pharmaceuticals? And if so, how far off may we be?
I think we're going to go in both directions towards more personalized and less, and for different reasons. So we just had a huge breakthrough in that a baby that was born with a rare genetic disease got a custom therapy that was made just for that one baby. And it happened quickly, and it was relatively inexpensive, as rare diseases go. Rare diseases typically are expensive, but this one was modest because it didn't require doing a large cohort FDA clinical trial because there really was only an N of one. And either you fixed it or you didn't, and it was fixed. And so that's on the hyper-personalized end. That is now a fact. It is a historical fact that this happened this year. Technology was queuing up, waiting for that opportunity. Some of the CRISPR and other technologies, sequencing technologies, led to it. At the other extreme, I think there's the generic. And you might say, in a world where we have all this ability to do personalized medicine, we can sequence your whole genome, which is pretty much unique to you, even if you're an identical twin. At the other extreme, there's the opportunity of having very affordable healthcare. That is to say, if you can develop something that is usable by billions of people, then you can bring the cost down from, say, millions of dollars for highly personalized, at least initially. You could probably bring it down into low hundreds of thousands in the next couple of years for a highly personalized medicine. But at the other end, you can bring it down to $30. And you can, in fact, you can make it so that it's essentially $0 because the government or the healthcare providers recover that money and then some, and so they can provide it for free to all the citizens. And a lot of what we try to do in my group is to not only make therapies that are and preventatives that are safe and effective, which is what the FDA mantra is, but also that are affordable worldwide, which is more the World Health Organization wants things to be safe, effective, and equitably distributed, accessible to everybody. And so by bringing down the cost of sequencing I talked about, bringing down the cost of gene therapy. So it turns out that the COVID-19 vaccine was in multiple different manufacturers, all converged on having a single gene in either RNA or DNA form in either a viral capsid or a lipid nanoparticle. So they all sound different, but they're all basically gene therapy formulations. And that helped. That was vaccines that were provided to 5.6 billion people worldwide. And I think it kept us down in the millions of deaths rather than what could have been much worse as it was in 1918 with the influenza virus that really didn't have an adequate vaccine protection the way we did in 2020 with COVID.
Yes, and that, of course, is an interesting discussion all in itself. I am deeply immersed in the health and wellness and longevity scene here in California, and there are opinions that just go wildly apart, and not even discussions, but real fights erupt when people start talking about vaccines. What really excited me about what you just shared, Dr. Church, was the generic aspect. I hadn't even thought about that before, but yes, of course, that makes complete sense. It's not only the ultra personalized, it is also the generic. And how can we bring more treatments, more medicines to people at low cost, or maybe at some point even no cost, and the government can actually take over even the minute costs, so it doesn't cost the individual anything. And affordable healthcare, that certainly is a topic that weighs very heavily on the current discourse. With regard to aging, different topic, but related. And what I learned about Rejuvenate Bio's approach was that it's about treating multiple age-related diseases simultaneously through gene therapy. And that sounds incredibly exciting and incredibly bold. Do you see a point where aging itself may become a treatable condition rather than a collection of symptoms, Dr. Church?
I think it's already happening. These things that we've developed at Rejuvenate Bio are making their way into clinical trials. That's mostly technologically de-risked. We just need to make sure that they're safe and effective in an FDA sense. You point out that you can do multiple gene therapies, and that is, I think, the way of the future. We already have the case for viruses, bacteria, fungi, cancer, all the things that can develop resistance to drugs. We typically now give them 4 or 5 drugs at once so that they can't, if they developed resistance to one, they're caught by the other one. So in a certain sense, more is better. Same thing with vaccines. Those, you can think of those, there are multiple vaccines that you get at once, typically. Then the DPT is one of the early ones. And collectively, you get maybe 20 of them. So I think this sometimes called polypharmacy or multiple drugs at once is the way to go. And for aging, it's very appropriate because it probably is it's not so much multiple diseases as multiple things that you can die of that are independently. You can die of inherited diseases, cancer, and so forth. And it's whack-a-mole. If you get rid of one of them completely, like you get rid of cancer completely, that might buy you an extra 2 years in your longevity. So bump you up from 73 years to 75. But if you push them all down at once, then you might get to escape velocity, where you just keep going, you keep researching, keep improving, but science is going faster than disease, rather than historically it's been going about 1/4 as fast. You get 1 year per 4 years, and so that means that's not quite enough for everybody. And aging is, in a certain sense, very analogous to the vaccine that I was talking about, in the sense that, in principle, the entire human population of the whole world was at risk for 1918 flu, and 2019, 2020 coronavirus. We did a much better job on coronavirus. The flu killed 50 million of us, probably 6 million excess deaths for coronavirus. But aging is similar. It affects all 8 billion of us, and therefore the prices can be basically the same range, $30 a dose, all of which can be recovered by reducing medical costs for the age-related diseases. Yeah, I think it's a very exciting avenue, and we're very close to moving into clinical trials.
That's fantastic, Dr. Church. And you're speaking about the medical cost, of course, there's also the human cost. What if human beings can really live to their highest potential of expression, unencumbered by disease, unencumbered by the symptoms of aging, and how that, of course, affects not only their immediate family, but the entire human family, and something that goes hand in hand with eradicating the symptoms of aging, or maybe even aging itself. What are the ethical or spiritual questions we need to ask as we are beginning to alter this fundamental arc of the human lifespan? Is there such a thing as aging if we are rewriting the very code of time, so to speak?
I think so. I think most modern aging researchers studying age-related diseases want to extend youth and are doing so, at least in the preclinical trials so far. So you want to be whatever your peak physical and mental capabilities might be. Now, physical is pretty easy to evaluate with athletics and so forth, but mental, there's this weird combination of a competition between filling your brain up with facts throughout your life, your education. My education is still continuing. I don't feel like I'm done being a student, but then there's inevitable cognitive decline that it starts kicking in, and almost everybody that lives past 90 is going to experience cognitive decline, maybe even, and many even well before that. And so right now, there's a cusp where you're maximally effective when you've learned all these skills, you've learned a little wisdom and so forth, and you haven't quite been affected by cognitive decline, which I hope is in that point is in my future, or maybe even never. But yeah, it's something that deserves our attention and respect in terms of, are we changing our contract with one another? Are we reinventing ourselves? To some extent, if we stay youthful, I think lots of people I've seen in my lifetime are very good at reinventing themselves through the normal process of aging. Maybe it'd be even easier if we're not worrying about disease. We've just cured the diseases of poverty, diseases of aging. We can focus entirely on reinventing ourselves. So we might have more personalities, more intelligences per person than we would have by starting from scratch from embryos every time. And we will still hopefully have lots of reproduction going on, maybe even random reproduction the way we do now. But that will be aimed at the stars. It'll be expanding where our sphere, the surface of our sphere is expanding some square law, and we're going to need lots of people and intelligence and wisdom to do that.
Yes, and something that goes hand in hand with this is also what I've been observing with the development of AI. And you recently joined an AI platform startup as chief scientist. And with your understanding of both AI and biology, what do you see as the greatest potential, maybe also the greatest risk when these fields converge?
Let's start with risk. I always like to start with risk because you need to sort that out before you go deep diving off the deep end. I actually think there's more risk and less value for language models for language. So people use language models for all kinds of things, but for language and for artificial general intelligence. And they're wrapped up in each other. There's some feeling that really properly parse complicated paragraphs, you need to have general intelligence, not just a dictionary. The problem is general intelligence leads to artificial AGI leads to artificial superintelligence, and that's something we haven't figured out in any good way, how to make sure that it will be benign, both to not just to us, but to itself. The part of the thing that helps humans survive is we've developed a set of morals and ethics, which even though they're not universal all over the planet and not universal over time, they're close enough that they keep us from killing ourselves so far. And it could be that AI that essentially doesn't have any parents and doesn't have any churches, other humanistic education, may just kill themselves and us all at once very quickly. We don't know. And the point is that uncertainty doesn't justify the small gains. And what's happening is companies are creating an artificial emergence, this feeling that, oh, we have to do this quickly. And they create this artificial, oh, so-and-so is doing it faster, then we have to go faster to keep up with them. And it's very much like the Cold War language, which is the Russians have more missiles than we do, so we have to close the missile gap. So anyway, that's the risk. I would say we should definitely slow down and require very strong evidence that we know how to handle general intelligence and language intelligence. Now, on the science AI, I think we can make something that's much narrower, and hence it's not aiming at general intelligence, it's avoiding it. And the promise there, my observation is I'm very underwhelmed by the difference between what ChatGPT or something understanding our speech is not that much advanced over maybe a decade ago when some of the first speech recognition existed that didn't claim it was AI. But I'm very impressed, in contrast to how biology, in particular protein design, teamed up with AI. It's a very narrow thing. We're not requiring that it understand, that make big decisions about the future of the workforce and the weapons and so forth. Just asking, can you make a protein that does this particular thing better or for the first time? And that works. That's spectacular. It's just like a natural. And we've got companies like Dino Therapeutics that's made it 100 times better at delivering genes to the brain. We've got almost any enzyme you can now design where we're making new parts of the genetic code. It's really a good match. Lila is aimed at repeating that success in a lot of different fields of science because the synergy that comes from thinking holistically about science without necessarily bestowing artificial general intelligence, in fact, avoiding it, I think, and they think, we think at Lila, that could be a sweet spot. And I think we all have to talk about safety for all technologies, and especially something like artificial general intelligence.
Certainly, Dr. Church. And that being said, from everything that you have observed in your field, and again, what I mentioned at the beginning of this conversation, just to also, I know we have limited time, but to close this conversation, from everything that you have seen so far, do you believe intelligence, true, creative, emergent intelligence, can arise in a synthetic substrate? And if so, you just already talked about it a little bit, but do you believe it could hold ethical responsibility if given the right impulses?
I think in an absolutely ideal world, we're already pretty much living in harmony with our intelligent devices. Maybe they're a little addictive, maybe there's some other negative sides. In an ideal future, we would benefit from superintelligence. We wouldn't be kept as pets, but as equals or semi-equal, and everything with no diseases and so forth. But I think we can achieve most of what we're aiming to get by helping humans achieve their full actualization as a top priority, rather than spending $1 trillion on GPUs, graphic processing units, for superintelligence. We could focus on spending some of those trillions on human health worldwide, and then we would be able to harness natural intelligence, which for the time being is better. It's more likely to be able to communicate morality and ethics. It's more likely to think out of the box and come up with, like Einstein's 1905 was a pretty good year for one person. But if anybody could be enabled to do that, if they so choose, that might be better than the artificial intelligence. So I think we need to have a more balanced portfolio focused a lot more on human actualization.
Wise words, Dr. Church. And coming to close of this conversation, I'd like to ask one final question. If we were to sit here again 100 years from now, and you could see the full arc of how your work rippled outward beyond patents, beyond publications and companies, what would you hope it made possible, not just scientifically, but for the soul of humanity?
First of all, some of our top priorities have been safety and accessibility. So safety beyond the kind of FDA safety, but thinking about all the unintended consequences, the way that somebody could accidentally or intentionally change the technologies. So I would hope that 100 years from now, we would be even better at safety and security than we are today, that we would have harnessed AI safely and securely, as well as synthetic biology, and that we will have eliminated diseases of poverty, of aging, psychiatric disorders, not so much eliminating neurodiversity, but enabling people who are maybe, if they want to be more or less diverse or turn it up and down from day to day. I think that would be better than having some judge and jury decide whether you're going to be neurodiverse or everybody else. So there's a cluster of things like that would be hoping to happen in the future, that humans would be able to reach their full potential in some kind of harmony with our own inventions, and that we are enabled medically, not just physically, to explore the universe, the solar system at least.
Yes. Beautiful closing words. Dr. Church, thank you so much for joining us today, for sharing your time, our, as of now, most valuable commodity, your insight and your vision. And thank you for your work and your candor and your courage to speak into and walk into the unknown. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm very grateful.
Thank you. It's been an amazing conversation. Thank you for providing so many of these conversations on the internet.
You are most kind, Dr. Church. Receive.
Superhumanize. Accelerated evolution.